welcome to AMAGI, co-hosted by myself, Dylan Moore of the Volitional Science Network, which you can find on YouTube, and Nima of economicsjunkie.com. We are here to tackle ideas, both ancient and modern, in an effort to bring you the tools needed to expand the power of your worldview, making you a more potent entity, professionally, politically, philosophically, or otherwise. We are graciously being hosted by the Think Liberty Network, which you can find at think-liberty.com. And in this 20-second episode, we're actually going to be doing a listener feedback response, specifically on MMT. So, Nima, are you excited to get back into a little bit of MMT after we did civilizations and vaccines?
Yeah, looking forward to it.
Awesome. So, this guy actually found me on the Tom Woods show because I did a debate with Bob Murphy on, it was more kind of an Austrian versus MMT economics debate. And he had several, we'll call them comments and criticisms.
Bob Murphy, of course, Mr. We don't need any evidence for our hypotheses.
Yes. Let's what's the word I want? Plug that video. The most recent interview with Stefan Molyneux and Bob Murphy. Bob Murphy literally says Austrian economists typically don't like/reject empirical evidence when it comes to their economics. So if that doesn't tell you it's pseudoscience, I don't know what does.
Well, and that's the one thing that, as far as I understand it, Bob, only the Austrian school gets right, which is why does it happen in the B2B or the business sector first, and then the recession hits the more personal or business to consumer market first? Like, why is it that businesses, in terms of capital investment and expansion, get things wrong with regards to wrong interest rate signals? Why does it happen to business first and only then to the general consumer? As far as I know, the Austrian school is the only school with a compelling explanation for that repetitive phenomenon.
Yeah, I agree. And just for, in case your listeners don't know, that this is, even though the Austrians do, especially Mises and Rothbard, they're very skeptical of, empirical studies, like they're more in terms of a priori theorizing. Skeptical of empirical studies, like they're more in terms of a priori theorizing. Still, don't misunderstand. In terms of just empirical, like what would the signature or the pattern in the data look like? It lines up with the Austrian survey. Like some of my favorite essays going against Paul Krugman were when he was saying after the 2008 crisis, well, gee, if this was a story about a housing boom and bust and reallocation, we would see this. And so I would go and look at the data and say, yeah, that is what we see. Your story about it's just people are afraid to spend, you would think retail would fall off a cliff and then it would percolate back. But no, it's, as you say, Stefan, it's the other way around. It's like capital good investments, those industries take a huge hit, and retail and service sector kind of just takes a smaller hit. So the story lines up very well with the Austrian approach, whereas if it's just hey, people are afraid to spend, and so the economy kind of shrinks, that doesn't line up with the particular sectoral adjustments that we see.
So I got several comments and criticisms, and we're going to go through them and use them as a basis for discussion on economics and modern money theory. And so, and it was very cordial. He was very nice. He's been listening to my stuff and Nima's stuff and, the stuff that we've been doing together. And he writes me a message. He says, I haven't seen all your videos yet, but the ones I've seen, I've enjoyed. No, actually, no, this is the end of it. Excuse me. He starts, I recently discovered your Volitional Science Network channel. That's my other channel. And enjoy your content as I have come from an Austrian background and recently had my worldview flipped upside down by MMT. That makes two of us, dude. That said, or I think three of us. Nima, you were Austrian at one point, weren't you?
Yeah.
Okay, that makes three of us. That said, I think you miss a few things, and I realize many of the episodes are nearly a year old, so your positions may have changed on some things since then. That might be true. Let's take a look at it. So the first point out of the 7 points he writes me is that Ayn Rand was not wrong about money. She was just starting from a different premise from MMT. Austrian economists were not wrong either. They were under a different paradigm. Now, to give a little background on this, there was a video that I did, and I think possibly a couple, where I was referring to Ayn Rand's book, Atlas Shrugged, where near the end of it, the main character, what the hell was her name? Dagny Taggart, something like that. In order to emphasize the philosophic difference between free exchange and forcing someone to do something, aka government, the way the government works, she used her lipstick to draw a U with an S over it, which is actually the dollar sign. I mean, if you look at the dollar sign, it's missing the little part on the bottom, the curve, but it more or less is a S over a U. And that was the emphasizing point that Ayn Rand put in the story, that the dollar, aka money, represents people's ability to freely exchange with each other. Therefore, freedom and individualism, in contrast to the government, which can only force and use violence to get people to do stuff. And I said, this is fundamentally wrong. Ayn Rand was fundamentally wrong about this, because the dollar and money in general, in essence, is a creation of the state. And the fact that we're able to freely exchange things with it and create a market out of it is a secondary effect. So he's telling me that Ayn Rand was not wrong about money in response to this. She was using different premises. Just as Austrian economists are not wrong either, they're using different premises.
No, they're under different paradigm, is what he's saying.
Oh, they're under a different paradigm, excuse me.
Which I think from now on, whenever someone proves me wrong, I'll just say, no, dude, I'm under a different paradigm. I'm not wrong. But anyway, I also wanted to point out that there's another section in Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged where, oh my God, it's been a while since I've read it, but there's this rich Argentinian rich kid who inherited some copper mines or something. D'Anconia is his name, I believe. Francisco D'Anconia. And he actually has a moment where he holds a pretty lengthy speech and holds up a gold coin and talks about how gold is the only true money. So that's another
error.
It's another section in that book where they specifically talk about the monetary policy and the Austrian version of it and the gold standard. I don't know if you remember that part.
I don't remember that part, but I do remember a part where when she made it into Galt's Gulch, and she saw how they were paying each other and noticed that they were paying each other with gold coins.
Oh, yeah.
And she pointed it out, and the guy, its name started with the M, I think it was the big banker who ran away to Galt's Gulch, said, yes, we only pay people with things of objective value.
Right.
Which is, again, this error that gold represents the objective value of money. Now, I think you nailed it in your initial reaction with this, which is, oh, no, I'm not wrong. It's just a different paradigm.
But what if the paradigm is wrong, right?
That's the point. That's a different way of saying the same thing, where the paradigm here is the barter theory of money, right? Exactly. This all comes down to whether or not this is the barter theory of money or the credit/state theory of money. And the paradigm that Ayn Rand and the Austrian economics are coming from is that that money is an advanced form of barter or developed out of barter. Yes, this is a different paradigm, and that paradigm is incorrect.
Yeah, in our opinion, that paradigm is not confirmed by the evidence of history, in other words.
Yeah, well, and then I think that's a good point to bring up, because in previous episodes, we actually went over specifically David Graeber's book, Debt, the First 5,000 Years, where he extensively shows the research available, both archaeological, historical, I said both, that would be 2, but here's 3, and anthropological, where you can look at modern Stone Age peoples who are still living in tribes in like South America and Australia and New Guinea, where no one's using, there is no barter system. there's no evidence that this has ever existed. Now, of course, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. But if you turn around and look at the other direction and say, okay, is there any evidence of state money? All you find is evidence of state money, going all the way back to Sumeria, and it probably goes back further than that. It's just Sumeria, they wrote on clay tablets, which managed to survive the last, 5,000 years. So we can read them.
Yeah, it's just the latest we have available to us.
So this is, I know we've been over it before, and we'll probably be going over it again, and we're going over it right now, and this just has to get hammered home. This is not a matter of opinion. This is a matter of the evidence brought forward. And the evidence brought forward is that the barter theory of money is incorrect.
Yeah, I have here an excerpt from an article that I read from a while ago, and we can link to that. And it says, various anthropologists have pointed out that this barter economy has never been witnessed as researchers have traveled to undeveloped parts of the globe. No example of a barter economy, pure and simple, has ever been described, let alone the emergence from it of money, wrote the Cambridge anthropology professor Caroline Humphrey in a 1985 paper. All available ethnography suggests that there has never been such a thing. When barter has appeared, it wasn't as part of a purely barter economy, and money didn't emerge from it. Rather, it emerged from money. After Rome fell, for instance, Europeans used barter as a substitute for the Roman currency people had gotten used to. In most cases we know about, barter takes place between people who are familiar with the use of money, but for one reason or another don't have a lot of it around, explains David Graeber, an anthropology professor at the London School of Economics. No academics I talked to were aware of any evidence that barter was actually the precursor to money, despite the story's prevalence in economics textbooks and the public's consciousness. Some argue that no one ever believed barter was real to begin with. The idea was a crude model used to simplify the context of modern economic systems, not a real theory about past ones. I don't think anybody believes that was ever a historical situation. Even the economists writing the textbook, Michael Beggs, a lecturer in political economy at the University of Sydney, told me, it's more of a thought experiment. So that's another nice way of putting it. It's a thought experiment.
I've heard this from multiple occasions, and even from myself, is that when you go through this thought experiment, it just it easily makes sense. It's something that's pretty easy to accept. We're like, oh yeah, I can follow that progression and it makes sense. However, it logically making sense to you isn't evidence. That's super important to realize, is that even if something logically makes sense to you, like if we look in the morning and watch the sun rise, it logically makes sense that the sun rises above the earth. But what was it? 400, 500 years ago, they had a huge debate about that, and logic in this case didn't win out. Evidence did.
Yeah.
So let's move on to number 2 here. So his second comment to me was that you seem to conflate money and currency, but I think there is an important distinction. Money is a medium of exchange and of savings. It can retain its value by its own nature. Currency is a medium of exchange, does not necessarily act as a medium of saving, and is usually issued by the state and tax driven. This is kind of an extension of point 1, where honestly, and I gotta say, I don't remember ever making this distinction. Maybe,
yeah, me neither.
Maybe that's the point that he's pointing out, is I have never made that distinction, therefore I'm conflating the two.
Right.
But I have the same answer as to number 1, which is no, money is the thing that doesn't have its own value by its own nature. Right?
Yeah. We do acknowledge that there are different types of money. You know, there's commodity-based money under a gold standard system or whatever, and there's fiat money, and then there's bank money that's issued by the banks, but it is essentially guaranteed by the state to be at par with fiat money. So there are different types of money that we just functionally observe in the economy. But, I don't know what he's stating there sounds very theoretical. I don't know what practically he's referring to.
I think I get it. And, maybe I'm sure he'll listen to this. Maybe he can correct me and we can talk about it, his correction later. But I think he's getting at gold, which is that, going to the Ayn Rand example that we talked about from Atlas Shrugged,
right.
Gold, right. How did he put it? Retains value by its own nature. This is going back to the objective value of things. And I could just only disagree. Like you just said, what makes the money is the fact that the state demanded it in taxes. It doesn't matter what it was made out of.
Right. I think that's correct. And he's trying to switch terms here and change definitions of certain words, I think, which I don't know if it's helpful.
I don't know if it's helpful either. Let's move on to number 3, because we're getting into inflation, and that's always fun.
Yeah.
He says inflation can happen before full.
Oh, sorry to interrupt. Regarding point 2, I also just want to point out that even in times when gold was a more widely used medium of exchange, it was never really a universal medium of exchange, by the way. But in times when it was actually used to settle certain debts and payments, it was also a tax token. You could redeem. You could repay your tax liability in it. And the value of gold coins with the government emblem on it, or with Caesar's head on it or whatever, circulated above the value of just the gold material inside it. So it's not necessarily that the gold kind of money that a lot of the Austrians envisage had value of on its own. It was more like, it was also a tax token, just stamped onto a different material, basically.
Exactly. So going on to number 3, he says, inflation can happen before full employment. Go back to Hazlitt's econ in one lesson. Employment is not the true economic goal. Production is. While I agree a job guarantee would be much better than our current system of stimulus and welfare, it's not necessarily true that more employment would cause productivity to rise as well. I think it was Bill Mitchell, who is also an MMT guy, who said on the topic of the job guarantee program, it doesn't matter what jobs we pay them to do. They could just dig holes and then refill them every day. Insanity. And if the system is structured in a way that drains currency from the functional economy, but when it's spent, it goes to the military Congress industrial complex military Congress industrial complex first, or it pulls it in, say, asset markets, you get systemic inequality, market distortions, and bubbles, which leads me to, and then he goes on to number 4, we'll address that in a second. Maybe in the past, I have said, oversimplified, that inflation doesn't occur until we've reached full employment. That is to say, as we continue to create more money, we're not going to see inflation until we reach full employment. And I'll say now, if I said that before, that is an oversimplification of the situation. And I don't think I've ever said that inflation can't happen until full employment is reached. There are other inflationary pressures.
Well, we actually specifically discussed under exactly the circumstance that he points out there. We've discussed it. It almost sounds like he got it from our podcast. That if the money is spent on very specialized work where you hire very scarce resources, such as engineers, such as, for example, the military-industrial complex, and also if the goods are used to destroy things and not add to the productive capacity, then certainly you're going to see inflation before full employment.
Yeah, I agree with him here. Where I agree with him here where he disagrees with Bill Mitchell, where he says it doesn't matter what jobs we pay them to do, they could just dig holes and refill them every day. Yeah, that's ridiculous.
Well, I mean, to Bill Mitchell's point, if the state imposes a certain level of taxation,
I get where you're going.
And then doesn't spend money at all, the money that is needed for net private savings. If they don't spend that money at all, then that's worse than them spending the money to dig holes and refill them. But it's all because the tax was imposed. So for people to be able to pay the tax and then save on top of that, there needs to be an injection of government money.
Somehow.
The only other option is for them to just eliminate their taxes. But if they don't, then it's preferable for them to dig holes and refill them than just withholding the money, to which the next step would be they would have to start confiscating people's property because they can't pay their taxes, and then ultimately, we discussed this before, if we take the concept of a government budget deficit in under balanced trade to its logical conclusion, then that would mean that everyone would be in debt to the state ultimately, and the state would own all property, and then that would be, the end of the free market, essentially.
Yeah. Well, and one thing that comes to mind was when we interviewed Ward Mosler a while back, and he emphasized that the money creation should be used for the public purpose. And the example that he gave for this was, he said, look, we could spend money and create jobs to build the Panama Canal, which in history permanently lowered all prices for shipping. I mean, worldwide shipping, obviously. Permanently lowered all prices for shipping forever, which is deflationary because shipping prices are kind of a base price for everything. Or we could take that money and go blow up a perfectly functioning country and destabilize it and create open slave markets like Obama and Hillary Clinton did in Libya. Yes, there are. We completely agree there are better ways to put that money into use, and largely the government puts them to use in very, very poor ways. And
sure.
I guess like what you said, to give Bill Mitchell credit here. Yeah, it doesn't make sense to pay people to fill up, dig holes and fill them up again. But I guess that's still preferable to say, fucking blowing people up.
Well, it's preferable to, I mean, actually, you're right. It would be preferable to replace the military-industrial complex with the desert sand digging complex, I guess, or something.
Yeah. Totally agree. And yes, that's funny, but it's darkly true. I think anyone listening to this should see that that's darkly true. We're not saying we should do that. We're just saying it's preferable to blowing people up.
Or it's also preferable to just to reference a documentary I was just watching where mad scientists have been putting wires in people's brains, doing pharmaceutical experiments on people under Department of Defense or Rockefeller or Macy's Foundation programs. Same thing there. I would probably think it'd be preferable if someone just dug a hole in the sand and refilled it.
Yeah. Let's go on to number 4. So he says, in one episode, you and Nima were adamant that there is no asset bubble right now. I think I remember that episode. Like I said, perhaps within the past year, you've changed your position. But in case you haven't, I'm not sure how you can look at the stock market and believe that. Look at corporate equities to GDP, trends of price to earning ratios, etc. If debt to GDP is rising, job guarantee or not, it means that currency is flowing somewhere that's not increasing productivity. If you look at the lower/middle class compared to the upper class, you can see exactly where it's going. This question is actually beyond my ability to answer. Nima, did you?
Yeah.
I'm not really sure.
No, I mean, I think I obviously understand what he's talking about. the reason why why I at least have been arguing that there isn't necessarily an asset bubble is that corporate profits have been rising and have been very strong. And also private sector leverage has been very low. And it's still, as far as the last readings at least, it is pretty low. And GDP has been rising faster than expected under Trump. So, so for those reasons, I don't necessarily argue that there's an asset bubble. Interest rates have been going up, so that has been sort of suppressing, and going up faster than expected.
Yeah, so that's been suppressing the stock market a little bit.
That's been maybe suppressing the stock market a little bit, just because when you price assets, the interest rate is in the denominator when you do your calculations. So if the interest rate goes up, then your stock market or your stocks become worth less, just by mathematical necessity or identity. But corporate profits have been solid. I was just going to pull up some charts here that I usually track because I haven't looked at them in a while. But
one thing I wanted to say too was, just because we're saying that we don't think that there's an asset bubble around the corner doesn't mean we think everything's great.
Right. No, and I'll get to that shortly. But yeah, so corporate profits right now which are, one of the prime drivers of stock market performance. Corporate profits are an all-time high. They reached a recent peak in Q3 of 2014, and then they hit bottom in Q4 of 2015. Then they've been slowly going up until Q4 2016. And then since Q1 2017, they've been increasing at an accelerated pace to where they're now at new record levels. And also another important factor is that private sector leverage has been very low. And by private sector leverage, I mean private sector income divided by private sector debt. So I usually track a sort of chart that I put together at the Federal Reserve of St. Louis's website. They have some pretty cool tools when you log in. And I'm just looking at it again right now. Q3 of 2018 is the latest data. Private sector debt is 2.25 times of income annually. And that is the lowest that it's been in since, let me see here, since Q3 of 2001. So,
nice. That's great.
And it's been going down actually since the beginning of since Q3 of 2016. It's been continuously going down, which is, I'm guessing it's a function of incomes rising so fast and GDP rising faster under the Trump administration, in part because of tax cuts, in part because of energy policy and stuff like that. I've argued that before. In fact, I've argued that right from the beginning of the Trump administration, that those will be pretty important factors in asset valuations, I believe. But so for those reasons, we've been arguing there is not necessarily an asset bubble. In 2007, we were at almost, or 2008 actually, Q4 2009, we were at 3 times income. Private debt to income was 3 times. That was in 2009. And now 10 years later, we're at 2.25. So somehow, private sector balance sheets are improving. You see? And when that's
great.
And when that is the case, and that means that the private sector is not under as much pressure, and that means that consumption isn't likely to collapse, and that means that corporate profits are likely to remain stable, etc., etc. Now, I've become slightly more cautious, and I may have mentioned that on the podcast. I think I did mention it on the podcast once or twice, that since the congressional elections, where the Democrats got the majority in the House, my outlook has become much more cautious, because now there's a majority in the House that is hell-bent on destroying this government's agenda. And
the PAYGO was a perfect example of that.
Yes,
remember
PAYGO that the neoliberal Democrats want to introduce. In anything, in fact, I think we can probably forget about the tax cuts becoming permanent under these political conditions. Now, who knows? That may change again in 2020. We'll see. But these are all things. Tax cuts are no longer likely to remain permanent, even though that's probably going to be a great thing to run on for the GOP. But and as you said, PAYGO and anything that gets introduced to force the government's budget towards balance or anything in that direction, that can lead to a crash in the stock market and the economy, because incomes, GDP will fall, and that means that debt to income ratios will go up, etc. All these numbers that I just cited, they're going to be heading south or north with the debt to income ratio. And that is a risk that is very real. And that's something that we have to watch. We don't know where it's going to go. Maybe there's going to be compromise. Maybe the Democrats in Congress, and that's another big wild card in my book, at least, is how many red state Democrats are there who can't completely go for broke, and who have to consider their constituents and sort of support economic agenda items. They're like,
I wonder if they're cracking already, and it's just Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer that's kind of keeping them in line, like the Three Stooges.
Yeah, we'll see about. But exactly,
slapping them and poking their eyes.
Well, yeah, I mean, we have a mentally ill woman running the House, and who knows how much people follow her or not. But this is something that I've definitely become more cautious since that has occurred. And I will become even more cautious once we start hearing talking points in the corporate media that suggest austerity or anything towards balanced budget.
I want to mention something about PAYGO too. I know we've been staying on this point for a long time, but if you guys listening didn't catch of all the insanity that came out of the House of Representatives the moment the new representatives came in after the election, one of them was this thing called PAYGO. I think even... was it Nancy Pelosi who introduced it? It doesn't matter. And the idea was that any increase in spending, and I think even any decrease in spending, has to be accompanied by a corresponding increase or decrease in taxation. And of course, by Democrats, that means if they increase spending, they'd increase taxes. Well, it's like rolling on the floor, laughing hysterically stupid, that the Democrats are going to come out all of a sudden and be worried about, we're spending too much money. But if you understand MMT, you understand exactly what's going on, is that the Democrats are trying to hamstring the Trump administration. Because they know that's how the federal government gets stuff done, is they create money to move resources, and they say stop. What they're doing is they're trying to stop Trump's ability to move the resources to where he needs them, or for what he thinks he needs for what he wants to do.
It's not even about creating money. It's about raising taxes, to taking more money out of the economy than.
Good point.
We're not advocating for bigger government. We're just advocating that for lower taxes and for a bigger deficit. That doesn't necessarily mean a bigger government.
Right. Let's move on to number 5, because we spent a lot of time on that. So he wrote to me. He said, one major point that I've heard you, that's me, make several times is the common misinterpretation of MMTers that taxation destroys currency, and that's how inflation is controlled. It has nothing to do, and that it has nothing to do with funding spending. This is simply not true. More accurately, this is an egregious oversimplification. The purpose of taxes is to fund government spending, whether the way that works operationally is by controlling inflation or directly paying for spending doesn't matter. Its purpose remains the same. I'll stop it right there. I think we got enough out of this, or else just be reading too much. This gets tricky in the uses of language, because we say that the government doesn't need, of course, again, reminder, we're talking about the federal government here. This does not apply to state and local governments. State and local governments have to tax in order to spend. For the federal government, their funding constraints their funding is not constrained by how much tax revenue that they actually bring in, but their funding is constrained by the fact that if they don't tax, the money's not going to be worth anything to spend it on.
Right.
So it's ripe for a fallacy of ambiguation. So you could say, okay, you said taxes don't fund spending, but they have to tax a little bit in order to have the money have any value to begin with. So yes, it does fund spending. Sure. But you got my fucking point to begin with, which is that they're not the government is not financially constrained. It's not like it can't type enough zeros into their computers in order to buy things because they didn't bring in enough zeros from tax revenues.
Yeah, and the purpose is not to fund. If we want to get nitpicky about the terms here, the purpose of taxation by a sovereign money issuer is not to fund government spending. It is to give the money value that the sovereign government introduces. That's different from funding. Funding means that you need to raise money to spend it on things, like in the private sector when you're an investor. And we're just pointing out that it's fundamentally different with a sovereign government.
Let me keep reading because I want to talk about, because he criticized me for using the term destroying currency. Even Mr. Mosler, that's Warren Mosler, has acknowledged in his language in the 7 Deadly Innocent Frauds, which is the book he wrote, is clunky and misleading, and he either has or will clarify in future editions that not all taxes are destroyed. The only money that is destroyed is old cash that needs to be removed from circulation. Now, again, I am going to say that this is an arbitrary point that doesn't actually matter. So whether or not, the cash gets shredded or the coins get melted or the computer digits vanish into oblivion that they came from, is all irrelevant. What's relevant is the private sector no longer has it.
Yeah, or whether the money is just stored somewhere at the Treasury or the Fed once it's collected. Same thing. It doesn't matter. It's not in the private sector. It doesn't do anything in the economy, is the point.
And it doesn't affect the government's ability to spend anymore.
Exactly, because the government spends by typing monies into bank accounts. Always has and always will. And it doesn't matter how much money they've collected or how much cash they have sitting somewhere.
So, I mean, the thing about, the IRS shredding bills, I don't think they shred all the bills from what I've heard.
No, they shred old bills. They shred old bills. And if there's a new bill that could be reused once the government spends again, then they say, oh, look, here's a good bill. So we can
use that again.
Reuse that.
Yep. So, yeah, it just doesn't matter. If I have the ability, and I want to put this in kind of personal terms, if I have the ability to create money out of snapping my fingers in the air and hand it to you, and then I tax some of it back from you, and instead of ripping it up, I put some in a pile next to me, the effect that has on my ability to snap my fingers or pay you from out of the pile, A, doesn't affect my ability to have as much money as I want, and B, doesn't matter to you, because all that matters to you is you don't have it anymore.
Right, or if, let's say, Dylan, you're my neighbor, and you come over and borrow some sugar from me and hand me an IOU for a cup of sugar that I can come back to you with to demand my equivalent amount of sugar at one day. And then I give you that IOU, let's say 3 days later, and then you give me a cup of sugar in return, and you keep the IOU in your files. What does it matter? It's you would usually rip it up and throw it away.
But maybe I'm thrifty and I want to keep that bill because I don't feel like writing another one. Yeah, it just doesn't matter.
Right.
Unless you got anything more to say, I'm going to move on that note.
Sorry, what was it?
Did you have anything more on that point? If not, I'll move on.
Yeah, I think we've addressed that point. Yeah.
So for point number 6, he actually, I don't think we could really answer it. He says,
"Oh no, but number 5, there's still some more in number 5, isn't there?"
I think he's okay. Let's go ahead. I think he's just talking more about the destruction of currency. The only money that destroyed is old cash that needs to be removed from circulation. I read that. Taxes are a drain of currency to the daily treasury statement, the account from which federal spending is drawn, not the destruction of it. All debts, household debt, are liabilities, but not all liabilities, treasury bonds, are debt. All destruction, paying off treasury bonds, are debits, but not all debits, federal taxation / treasury bond sale collections, are destruction. I think everything we just said answers this.
Yeah.
Although he did make a point, or I just remembered it now. He said at the beginning that one of the common misinterpretations of MMTers is that taxation controls inflation.
Okay. Yeah.
Or inflation is controlled by destroying currency. That affects inflation maybe a little bit. I don't think I've ever said that is the way that inflation is controlled.
Right. I mean, we've talked about, or some MMTers at least say that when you have full employment and inflation starts picking up, then taxation can be a tool to reduce inflation.
Yeah.
So one more thing here because what he's stating here is something we've also discussed. Taxes are a drain of currency to the daily treasury statement, the account from which federal spending is drawn, not the destruction of it. Okay, but if you you have to look at the entire process from start to finish of taxing and spending. And we've done that before. We'll have to look up the podcast. I think we went through that with Warren Mosler actually on that podcast. But yes, there are some mechanisms that the government and the bureaucracy have added in between that make it look as though the government is spending money that they've raised by taxing. However, if you net all the different accounts out against each other, you will come up with a cycle that really consists of the government spends money into existence and the government destroys that money from the private sector by taxing it out of it.
Yep. I'm going to move on to number 6.
And by the way, that's in Randy Ray's Modern Monetary Theory. If you recall, that complicated multi-step.
That's the reason I called Warren Mosler to begin with, was because I didn't understand that part of the book. I remember that.
Right. Yeah, I don't know if we want to go through that now, but that would probably be too much.
I think it'd be too much at this point. I think we got enough time just for the end here. So number 6, I don't think I have much to say because he says, in one episode you discussed interest rates having the opposite effect of what most people think. Linked here is an article that I think does a good job of addressing why Mosler says this. Well, I didn't have time to read the article before this, and I'm not going to try to read it here now. So I guess we could link that article below. Everybody else can read it, and maybe we could read it later and talk about it later. Let's move on to 7. In 7, he says, I think in the same episode, you discussed pricing and the video was very confusing and hard to follow. This may have been a video that I did that Nima immediately chastised me about, and we had to make another video about pricing, where I was quite wrong about stuff. I think it would be a good idea to re-tackle the subject in another video now that I'm sure you're more familiar with MMT. A concept I think may help pricing make sense is George Reisman's concept of the primacy of profit. That is to say that the primary and most important objective of business is to make a profit. At least since the days of Adam Smith, it has been taken for granted that the original income was wages and that profits are a deduction from wages. But it is the opposite that is true.
Yeah, I mean, just real quick on pricing, and I think that's probably an interesting book that he's recommending there, because prices really are set by business people, and prices are set such that a surplus is generated, and such that a surplus accrues to the owners of the business. And if you want to look at it totally from a macroeconomic perspective, the business sets prices such that they are above the wages, so that the workers in that sector can't consume all the goods produced in that sector, which leaves a surplus that can be consumed by the owners of the business, or if we look at an aggregate, the owners of all businesses. And then going further than that, even there, without investment spending, it would actually not be possible to have an aggregate profit, because people who are employed in the investment sector are paid, yet they don't churn out any consumer goods that are available for purchase. So the people who get paid in the investment sector buy up part of the surplus that is generated by the consumer goods sector. But it all comes back to, prices are the businessman's attempt, or the business owner's attempt to generate a surplus. I don't know which confusing video he's talking about there or whatever, but
yeah,
that's
I think I know which one. And in that video, I think I was confusing and I was incorrect. So
yeah, but that's just a real quick primer on prices.
Excellent. So he finishes this out and he says, I haven't seen all your videos yet, but the ones I have seen I've enjoyed. So keep making great content. Excellent. And always check and recheck your premises. I would say that right back to you, dude. As I'm sure you know, it's easy to get wrapped up in MMT, which has been hijacked by progressives as a vehicle to push their agenda. It's up to liberty-minded people like us to keep MMT pure, I'm not sure what that means, rather than an excuse to have unlimited spending in the name of the public good, looking at Stephanie Kelton. I don't know what it means to keep MMT pure, but I think we're just trying to have the conversation to get people aware of the way things actually work, so we're not, like Austrian economists just arguing over astrology.
Well, I think part of checking and rechecking your premises is to never assume that you're pure. So I would never really claim that I am keeping MMT pure or anything like that.
Maybe he's getting at the fact, we've mentioned this before, which is there's the prescription and the description of MMT. And the progressives seem to mold those two things into one. And one of the things that we've tried to do is say, look, here's how it works. Now, these guys have taken that and said, well, this is what we should do with it. We're not saying we should do that with it, but we're still saying that the way this works is accurate.
And you should make sure. This is so, I think it's so brilliant how Warren Mosler put this. And it's really allowed me to zoom out a little bit. MMT in economics says that there has to be a net private savings so that the economy can grow. And that's empirically pretty well established. How you get the net private savings, there are different methodologies. Some prefer the left-wing approach, which is big government spending. Some prefer the so-called right-wing approach. I'm simplifying right now, but whatever, which is cutting taxes. And which one you prefer is a political decision, not an economic decision. But we're talking about economics here. And economics is ideally agnostic to politics. And I think MMT makes it very plain and obvious how economics can be agnostic towards politics. There are different political methods to attain the goal that must be attained, which is private sector needs to have net private savings. And then there's also, of course, export surpluses.
Of
So
course.
some economies just go for, okay, we got to crank out export goods, but it's obviously not sustainable, and it's not something that can work everywhere, because if there's an exporter, then there must be a net importer somewhere else.
Right. So with that, that's the end of the questions. And by the way, this guy's name was Jared, and I want to say thank you, Jared, for A, listening, and B, coming up with this, with the points, because obviously you listened to the videos and you had some criticisms of it. It's not like you just wrote me a hate mail, or you watched 5 minutes of one video and then wrote me a text wall on YouTube, like a lot of people like to do. I get a lot of those. By the way, if you write me a text wall on YouTube, I'm not going to read it. So with that, this has been AMAGI, episode 22, and we are being graciously hosted on the Think Liberty Network, which you can find at think-liberty.com, and we will see you next time. Thanks for listening.